Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
A September morning wrapped Hogwarts in golden mist that drifted in gentle waves across the lake's surface. Professor Flitwick stood by his office window, watching sunlight dance upon the water. After the war, such peaceful mornings seemed particularly precious, like gifts he had long been afraid to accept. The castle was stirring to life. Voices of students hurrying to breakfast echoed through the corridors, whilst the scent of fresh bread and hot chocolate wafted from the kitchens. Flitwick smiled at the familiar din. Some things never changed, and this comforted him greatly. He turned back to his desk, where tall stacks of essays awaited marking. The seventh years had written about the Fidelius charm and the ethical aspects of its use, and the professor eagerly anticipated reading their work. Complex protective charms had always been his passion. The elegant interplay between trust, secrecy, and magical power reminded him of the most delicate musical harmonies. Taking up his quill, he immersed himself in reading the first essay. Miss Waverley from Ravenclaw had demonstrated an impressive understanding of the theoretical principles of casting the charm, though her reflections on the moral responsibility of the secret keeper required deeper analysis. Flitwick made several notes in the margins of the parchment, trying to phrase his criticism constructively and encouragingly. Suddenly, the air in the room hummed. Not harshly, not threateningly, rather like the distant echo of an ancient bell. Flitwick raised his head, alert. Through long years of teaching, he had learned to distinguish different kinds of magical vibrations, and this was unusual, old, something that carried within it the echo of long-forgotten times. He approached the window. The courtyard appeared peaceful, but something was amiss. Shadows lay at strange angles, as if the sun had suddenly shifted from its place. And then he saw the figure. Someone stood in the middle of the clearing between the forbidden forest and the castle. From such a distance, details were impossible to make out, but Flitwick felt a gaze directed straight at him. A cold wave ran down his spine, a sensation he had not experienced for years. The professor hurried from his office. The corridors of Hogwarts, usually so cozy, now seemed longer than usual. His footsteps echoed against the stone walls, creating a rhythm that strangely harmonized with the humming that still vibrated in the air. In the Great Hall, the usual morning bustle prevailed. Students sat at the long tables, consuming breakfast and discussing homework. Flitwick noticed several familiar faces among the seventh years. They looked more mature after the summer holidays, ready for their final year with all its trials. "Good morning, Professor Flitwick," Professor Cassandra Thane greeted him, the new defense against the dark arts teacher. She was a tall, middle-aged woman with penetrating gray eyes and silver hair gathered in a severe bun. A former Auror, she had come to Hogwarts after many years of service at the Ministry of Magic. "Good morning, Cassandra," Flitwick replied, but his attention was fixed on the great windows of the hall. "Have you noticed anything unusual this morning? Any visitors?" Thane looked at him more attentively. Her professional instincts, honed by years of working with dangerous criminals, immediately sharpened. "No, what's happened?" she asked quietly, so as not to attract the student's attention. Before Flitwick could answer, the great doors of the hall burst open with a thunderous crash. But no one entered. Instead, a figure appeared in the doorway that seemed to consist of shadow and silver light simultaneously. It was approximately human-sized, but its outlines flickered like a reflection on troubled water. The students' conversations died away. Someone among the younger years cried out, but the sound seemed to dissolve in the air without reaching anyone's ears. The entire space of the Great Hall filled with that same ancient vibration Flitwick had felt in his office. The figure moved slowly through the hall, and where its feet touched, faint silvery traces appeared on the stone floor. Students instinctively pulled away, but not from terror, rather from reverence before something ancient and powerful. Phileas Flitwick, the figure spoke, and its voice was like an echo, multi-layered, as if several people were speaking simultaneously. "I have come for you." Flitwick felt his heart quicken its pace, but outwardly remained calm. Years of teaching had taught him to maintain composure in the most unexpected situations. "Who are you?" he asked, taking a step forward. "And what do you want?" I am the echo of the one you defeated, the figure replied, its contours becoming clearer. Now one could make out the outlines of a face, young, with sharp features and eyes that burned with cold fire. I am the shadow of the one who fell to your wand 30 years ago. 30 years. Flitwick tried to remember. 30 years ago, he had been at the height of his dueling career, a champion who traveled the continent, participating in tournaments and private matches. How many opponents had there been? How many duels? Some remained in memory as vivid recollections, others blended into one continuous sequence of spells and victories. I don't remember you, the professor admitted honestly. The figure laughed, and this laughter was like the sound mirrors make when shattering, ringing, yet disturbing. Of course you don't remember. For you, it was an ordinary victory. Another star in your champion's crown. The figure's contours became even clearer, and now Flitwick could see details of clothing. Elegant dueling robes of dark blue with silvery trim. But for me, it was everything. The end of dreams, the end of hopes, the end of the future. Professor Thane discreetly moved closer to the students, keeping her wand at the ready. Her experience suggested the situation could quickly spiral out of control. If you seek a rematch, Flitwick said, drawing his wand, then I accept your challenge. But not here. Not where students might be harmed. Oh, but precisely here, the figure replied, spreading its arms. Precisely where all can see how the great champion falls. Just as happened to me once. The air in the hall hummed more intensely. The torches on the walls flickered, their light becoming unstable and wavering. Students began to grow anxious, but somehow could not move from their places, as if some force held them there, making them witnesses to what was about to unfold. Professor, one of the Hufflepuff students whispered, "What is that thing?" But Flitwick could no longer answer. The figure raised its hand, and in its palm appeared a wand woven from silver light. It was remarkably beautiful, slender, with intricate patterns that shimmered like living metallic thread. "En garde, champion," the figure whispered. The duel began without warning. A silvery beam flew toward Flitwick with lightning speed. The professor barely managed to deflect it with shield charms, feeling the spell's power pierce his defense like a hammer. "Protego Maxima," he exclaimed, creating a more powerful shield. But the figure was already moving, its body gliding across the floor like a dancer. A second beam, a third, each from a different angle, each with different force. Flitwick retreated, deflecting attacks whilst trying to find his opponent's rhythm. Stupefy! His red beam pierced the air but passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. "You still don't understand," the figure said, attacking again. "I am not one you can easily defeat with a stunning spell." The next attack was a combination, 3 spells simultaneously, each with a different color and purpose. Purple light tried to bind Flitwick, yellow to disorient him, and white to knock him backward. The professor spun on the spot, his wand moving with incredible speed, creating a complex pattern of protective charms. Protean Shield. His favorite spell created a shimmering barrier that adapted to each attack. But the figure was prepared for this too. The silver light of its wand changed to deep purple, and the next spell pierced Flitwick's shield as if it were made of paper. Impedimenta. Flitwick tried to slow his opponent, but the magic passed through him without effect. Expelliarmus. He attempted to disarm the figure, but the silvery wand didn't even tremble. The situation was becoming desperate. Flitwick retreated toward the staff table, deflecting increasingly powerful attacks. His breathing quickened. It had been long since he had participated in such intense duels. Finite incantatum. He tried to dispel the figure itself, but this only angered his opponent. "Do you think I can be dismissed so easily?" the figure laughed. "I was born from your victory. I live through your glory, and I will not vanish until I have what is mine." A powerful spell knocked Flitwick from his feet, throwing him against the wall. Students cried out, but still could not move. Professor Thane tried to intervene, but her spells also passed through the figure without effect. Flitwick rose, feeling pain in his left shoulder. Blood trickled from a scratch on his forehead, but his gaze remained steady. Years of teaching might have dulled his reflexes, but they had not broken his spirit. "Very well," he said, wiping away the blood. "If you want a true duel, then you shall have it." He raised his wand, and golden sparks began to glimmer around it. This was a spell he hadn't used for many years, one of those that had brought him champion's fame. Aurum Gladius. From his wand's tip emerged a sword of golden light, long and swift, humming with magical energy. The figure stopped, for the first time in the entire duel looking surprised. "You remember," it whispered. "I'm beginning to remember," Flitwick replied, holding the light sword with both hands. It was in Prague, a duel on the roof of the magical observatory. You were younger than I, ambitious, talented. The figure nodded, its outlines becoming even clearer. Now Flitwick could see its face, handsome, but twisted with bitterness and anger. My name was Severus Darkling, it said, and I was meant to become the greatest duelist of my generation, until you destroyed my dreams. Flitwick remembered now, a young man, full of ambition, who had challenged him to a duel before hundreds of spectators. The duel had been spectacular, one of the most beautiful in his career. But he had won, as always. What happened to you after that duel? The professor asked. I lost everything, the figure replied. Reputation, admirers, faith in myself. I sank to the bottom, took up dark magic, trying to find the strength for a rematch. But I died before I could find you again. So you are dead, Flitwick stated. Dead, but not destroyed. My hatred, my ambitions, they created me anew. An echo that lives for a single purpose. The figure raised its silvery wand. To finish what I began 30 years ago. The golden sword in Flitwick's hands sparkled brighter. He felt ancient skills returning, muscles remembering movements perfected through years of training. If this is the only way to give you peace, he said, then so be it. They rushed toward each other simultaneously. The golden sword met the silvery wand in the center of the hall, and from the collision, a wave of magical energy rolled throughout the entire castle. Windows trembled, torches blazed with brighter light, and students finally could move, retreating to the walls. The duel gathered momentum. Flitwick advanced with his sword, using techniques that combined swordsmanship and magic. The figure defended itself with its wand, creating complex defensive patterns and counterattacking with spells that changed color from silver to deep red. Flammare Circulus. The figure created a ring of fire around Flitwick. Aqua Spiralis. The professor sliced the air with his golden sword, and a spiral stream of water extinguished the flames. They danced a deadly dance throughout the hall, their spells illuminating the ancient walls with a spectrum of colors. Flitwick felt adrenaline pulsing through his veins. He was once again the young champion, master of his craft. But something was wrong. With each minute of the duel, the figure became more material, more real. Flitwick, conversely, began to feel fatigue. Do you notice? The figure laughed, evading another sword strike. The more we fight, the stronger I become, while you age before our eyes. This was true. Flitwick felt his strength leaving him, his hands growing heavier, his breathing becoming labored. As if the figure were draining his energy, his memories of dueling glory. What are you doing? He asked, retreating. I am reclaiming what belongs to me, the figure replied, its voice becoming deeper, more human. Your glory, your mastery, your victories. Everything you took from me 30 years ago. Flitwick understood the horrible truth. This was not an ordinary echo or ghost. This was a magical entity that fed on his dueling abilities, his memories of victories. And the more he fought, the weaker he would become. The golden sword in his hands began to dim. The figure, conversely, became almost completely human-like, a young man with passionate dark eyes and confident movements. Now you understand, Darkling said, his voice no longer sounding like an echo but like a living person's. I cannot die until I reclaim everything I lost, and you cannot defeat me without giving me your strength. Professor Thane tried again to intervene, but an invisible barrier prevented her from approaching the duelists. Students watched in horror as their beloved professor weakened before their eyes. Flitwick lowered his wand. His breathing was heavy, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He understood he had fallen into a trap with no simple escape. What do you want? He asked. A rematch, Darkling replied, now fully material. A true rematch. Not here, not surrounded by children and the castle's protective charms. Where it all began. In Prague, on the observatory roof. In a week, when the moon is full, as it was that night 30 years ago. And if I refuse? Darkling smiled a cold smile. I will remain here, challenge you to duel again and again, every day, until I have completely drained you. And then take your place, your life, your identity. He surveyed the hall full of frightened students. And who knows what I'll do to them when I become strong enough. Flitwick knew he had no choice. He nodded. Very well. I accept your challenge. Excellent. Darkling began to dissolve into the air, becoming semi-transparent again. 1 week, Phileas. Prepare yourself for the most important duel of your life. The last duel of your life. With these words, he vanished, leaving only a faint scent of ozone and metal. The Great Hall gradually returned to normal, Torches burned with steady light, windows ceased trembling, and students could finally breathe freely. Flitwick sank heavily onto a bench by the Hufflepuff table. His hands trembled, and in his eyes was the fatigue of a man who had suddenly aged several years. Professor Thane approached him. What was that? A mistake from the past, Flitwick replied quietly, looking at his reflection in the polished surface of the table. A mistake I must now pay for. Students gradually dispersed, whispering among themselves about what had transpired. But Flitwick knew this was only the beginning. The real trial awaited him ahead, in the city where it all began, under the light of the full moon, in a duel that would decide not only his fate, but the fate of all those he loved. 1 week. He had only 1 week to remember everything he had learned during his championship years, and find a way to defeat an opponent who grew stronger with each encounter. But first, he needed to understand what exactly had happened to Severus Darkling after that duel 30 years ago, and why his hatred had proved so powerful that it could create this terrible magical entity. The answers lay in the past, and Flitwick knew he would have to return there. Flitwick sat in his office deep into the night, when the castle slept and only the portraits on the walls occasionally whispered amongst themselves. Before him on the desk lay old photographs and newspaper clippings, memories of times that seemed like another life entirely. Phileas Flitwick triumphs in international dueling tournament, proclaimed the headline of the Daily Prophet from the summer of 1994. In the photograph, a younger Flitwick raised a golden cup above his head, his face glowing with happiness and pride. Around him applauded a crowd of spectators, wizards from all over Europe who had come to watch the continent's finest duelists. He remembered that day. The final duel against Antonio Valteri, the famous Italian wizard, had taken place in the arena of the Colosseum in Rome. Valteri had been a master of aggressive spells, but Flitwick had triumphed through elegance and precision. Their match had lasted nearly an hour, the longest duel in the tournament's history. The professor turned the page of the album. Here he was in Vienna, 1995, after victory over Austria's champion. And this, Madrid, 1996, where he had first employed his signature technique, the dance of light, a combination of 15 different spells executed in one seamless sequence. But most memories were connected to Prague. The Czech city had become his second home in those years. There the most prestigious duels were held. There gathered the most talented wizards of Europe. And there, on the roof of the magical observatory, he had conducted his most legendary matches. Flitwick retrieved a separate album, smaller, more worn than the others. On the cover, in golden letters, was written Prague, City of Duels. The first page showed a panorama of magical Prague, spread along the Vltava. The observatory towers rose above the city like magical lighthouses, their domes shimmering with protective charms. He recalled his first visit to Prague. It had been in 1993, when he was only 35, a young Hogwarts professor who had just begun teaching, but already had a reputation as a brilliant duelist. The director of the magical observatory, Professor Vladimir Novotny, had personally invited him to participate in the prestigious tournament Stellar Crown. I remember that night as if it were yesterday, Flitwick whispered, touching the photograph of the observatory with his finger. The memory enveloped him. Prague, summer 1993. The roof of the magical observatory beneath a starlit sky. The younger Flitwick stood in the center of a magical circle drawn with silvery lines on the observatory roof. Around him gathered a crowd, Europe's finest duelists, journalists from magical publications, aristocrats of the wizarding world. The air was filled with electric anticipation of a great match. His opponent was Severus Darkling, a 25-year-old prodigy from England, who in 2 years had managed to defeat several experienced champions. Darkling was a handsome young man with dark hair and piercing green eyes. He wore dark blue dueling robes with silvery trim, the very same that Flitwick had seen today on the Echo. "Gentlemen duelists," proclaimed the arbiter, an elderly wizard in golden robes, "you know the rules. Duel until the first serious defeat or acknowledgement of surrender. Only the unforgivable curses and spells that might cause death are forbidden." Flitwick nodded, holding his wand, hawthorn, 12 inches, with unicorn hair. Then it had not yet seemed so old and familiar to him. Every spell was a discovery, every duel an adventure. Darkling smiled coldly, displaying his wand, oak, 13 inches, with dragon heartstring core. It was perfectly balanced and adorned with intricate patterns. "I have long awaited this meeting, Professor Flitwick," Darkling said in a voice full of confidence. "Your reputation precedes you." "As does yours, Mr. Darkling," Flitwick replied politely. "I have heard much good about your abilities." The arbiter raised his hand. The crowd fell silent. Stars above Prague twinkled especially brightly, as if the very heavens had paused to watch the match. "Begin." Darkling attacked first. A swift red beam flew toward Flitwick with incredible speed. But the experienced duelist was ready. "Protego!" His shield blazed with silver light, deflecting the attack into the starry sky. "Stupefy!" Flitwick counterattacked, but Darkling easily evaded, his movements graceful and precise. "Petrificus totalis." The young duelist tried to immobilize his opponent, but Flitwick deflected the spell and responded with a series of rapid attacks. "Expelliarmus." "Impedimenta." "Confundo." 3 spells simultaneously flew toward Darkling. The young wizard spun on the spot, creating a protective vortex that scattered the attacks. "Impressive," someone from the crowd whispered. The duel gathered momentum. Darkling displayed his signature technique, the shadow dance. He moved so quickly that it seemed as if several copies of him were running around the arena simultaneously. Spells flew from different angles, creating a complex pattern of light and energy. But Flitwick had not earned his reputation as a master for nothing. He closed his eyes for a moment, trusting his other senses. Every spell had its unique sound, its vibration in the air. He had learned to distinguish them in his youth. Protean Shield. His favorite spell created a shimmering barrier that adapted to each of Darkling's attacks. "What the devil?" someone from the crowd exclaimed. Most duelists had never seen such complex protective charms. Flitwick opened his eyes and smiled. It was time to show his mastery. Lumos Multiplicato. From his wand's tip burst a beam of light that instantly divided into a dozen separate beams, each with a different color and effect. Darkling tried to deflect them, but it was impossible. Some beams were genuine attacking spells, others were illusions, still others were support spells that enhanced Flitwick's next attack. "Astounding," Professor Novotny whispered. "I have never seen such technique." One of the beams reached its target. Darkling clutched his left arm, from which blood trickled in a thin stream. The wound was shallow but symbolic, first blood in the duel. "First blood goes to me," the arbiter announced. "Continue." Darkling's face changed. Cold confidence transformed into something darker, a mixture of anger and despair. He realized he was losing to one of Europe's finest duelists, and this realization enraged him. "You don't know whom you're playing with," he hissed. The next attack was far more vicious. Darkling employed spells that balanced on the edge of what was permitted, dark charms that targeted not only the body but the mind of the opponent. Crucio Minoris, a weaker version of the unforgivable curse, flew toward Flitwick. The crowd gasped. Such spells were technically not forbidden, but their use was considered unethical in sporting duels. Flitwick barely managed to deflect the curse, feeling the dark magic singe the edges of his protective charms. "Mr. Darkling," the arbiter warned, "be careful with your choice of spells." But the young duelist had already lost self-control. His attacks became chaotic, desperate. He threw everything he knew at Flitwick, not thinking about strategy or elegance. "Sectum Sempra." "Defendo." Entral expelling curse. Flitwick deflected the attacks, but with each minute it became clearer that his opponent was crossing all boundaries. This was no longer a noble duel. It was becoming a real battle. "Enough," Flitwick said firmly. "I am ending this." He raised his wand high above his head, and golden sparks began to circle around it. The air hummed with concentrated magical energy. Aurum Gladius Maxima. From his wand's tip emerged an enormous sword of golden light, 3 feet long, pulsing with powerful energy. This was one of the most complex battle spells, requiring tremendous concentration and mastery. The crowd fell silent. Even experienced duelists had never seen anything like it. Flitwick advanced with the sword, but not to attack. With one precise movement, he sliced through the air, creating a wave of golden energy that surrounded Darkling from all sides. "Finite Tot Alum." The final spell dispelled all of the young duelist's active charms, leaving him defenseless. Flitwick's wand tip touched Darkling's throat. "I yield," the young man whispered, his voice trembling with humiliation. The crowd erupted in applause. Flitwick stepped back, dispelling the golden sword, and politely bowed to his defeated opponent. "An excellent duel," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. But Darkling did not accept it. Instead, he looked at Flitwick with such hatred that the surrounding air seemed to grow cold. "This is not the end," he whispered so quietly that only Flitwick heard. "Someday I will return, and then we shall see who the true champion is." With these words, he turned and left, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps on the stone slabs of the roof. The memory shattered. Flitwick shook his head, returning to the present. His office once again surrounded him with warmth and comfort, but the chill of that ancient gaze could still be felt in the room. He remembered what had happened after that duel. Darkling had vanished from the dueling arena as suddenly as he had appeared. Other tournament participants said he had begun studying dark magic, seeking ways to increase his power. Someone had heard he had traveled to distant lands, learning forbidden techniques. Others claimed to have seen him in Nocturne Alley, trading artifacts of dubious origin. And then about 5 years later came news of his death. Darkling had perished in some failed magical experiment. He had attempted to master a spell that proved beyond his capabilities. Flitwick had even felt pity for his former opponent then. Such a young and talented person, destroyed by his own ambitions and pride. A knock at the door interrupted his musings. Professor Thane entered the office, carrying a teapot and 2 cups. "I thought you might need company," she said, setting the teapot on the table. "And hot tea wouldn't go amiss either." "Thank you, Cassandra." Flitwick pushed aside the albums, clearing space. "You are most thoughtful." Thane poured the tea, an aromatic blend with bergamot and honey. Warm steam rose from the cups, creating a cozy atmosphere. "Would you like to tell me about what happened?" she asked gently. "About this Darkling?" Flitwick nodded and told her everything. About his dueling career, about that fateful night in Prague, about how an ambitious young man had transformed into an embittered person who had died seeking the power for revenge. "And now he has returned as some sort of echo," the professor concluded. "Something created from his hatred and envy that feeds on my memories of glory." Thane thoughtfully sipped her tea. "I have experience working with similar entities," she said finally. "When I was an Auror, we encountered several cases of emotional echoes, magical beings born from strong feelings that survived their owner's death." "And how did you fight them?" "That depends on the echo's nature. Some can be dispelled by force, others only by understanding and forgiveness. But they all have one common trait: they feed on the energy of the person they're connected to." Flitwick nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I felt during the duel. The more I fought, the weaker I became, while it grew stronger." "Then this trip to Prague might be a trap," Thane warned. "If it's calling you there, where everything began, it may be hoping to become strong enough to replace you." This thought sent a chill down Flitwick's spine. Personality replacement, one of the most horrific forms of dark magic. If the Echo was indeed planning something similar. "But I have no choice," he said. "If I don't appear, it will remain here at Hogwarts. And the students?" "The students will be safe," Thane said firmly. "I'll see to that. But you cannot go alone. The duel must be one-on-one. Those are the rules. The rules of the duel, yes. But no one said you cannot have support outside the arena." She smiled resolutely. "I'm coming with you to Prague." Flitwick wanted to object, but he saw in her eyes the same determination that had made her a successful Auror. Besides, he would indeed be glad to have a reliable companion nearby. "Very well," he agreed. "But first I need to prepare. In the morning I'll go to the library. I need to research the nature of such echoes, find their weaknesses. And I'll contact my former colleagues at the Ministry," Thane added. "Perhaps they know something about Darkling's magical experiments before his death." They drank their tea in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Outside the window, night gradually yielded to dawn, painting the sky in gentle shades of pink and gold. "Professor," Thane said at last, "may I ask a personal question?" "Of course. Why did you abandon your dueling career? You were at the height of your fame, had every opportunity to become a legend. What stopped you?" Flitwick pondered, looking at the dawn outside the window. "You know, after that duel with Darkling, something changed. I saw how fame and ambition could corrupt a person, turn talent into obsession." He smiled sadly. "Besides, I realized that my true calling was not defeating people, but teaching them, educating a new generation of wizards who would be wiser than us." "And you never regretted that decision?" "Never," Flitwick answered without hesitation. "At least, not until today. Now I'm beginning to understand that the past sometimes returns to remind us of our choices." Thane stood, collecting the empty cups. "Then we had better prepare for this return as well as possible. Shall we meet in the library in the morning?" "Absolutely," Flitwick nodded. "And Cassandra, thank you for your support." When she had gone, Flitwick returned to his albums. But now he looked at them differently, not as nostalgic memories, but as sources of information. Every duel, every technique, every move, all of this might be needed in a few days. He took out a separate notebook and began writing down everything he remembered about his best spells, most effective combinations, most complex techniques. If Darkling's echo truly fed on his memories of dueling glory, then he needed to remember not only the victories but the methods by which he had achieved them. Morning found him still working. The sun was already rising over Hogwarts, illuminating the castle with warm golden light. Students would begin waking in an hour, and with them, the usual rhythm of learning and life. But for Flitwick, everything had changed. Ahead lay a journey into the past, a meeting with his own achievements and mistakes, and possibly the most important duel of his life, one that would decide not only his fate, but the fate of all those he loved. He looked at the photograph from Prague one last time, then carefully closed the album. The time for reminiscence had passed. The time for action had come. In a week, under the light of the full moon, on the roof of the magical observatory, everything would be decided. And this time, Flitwick was determined not merely to win. He had to understand what exactly had happened to Severus Darkling, and find a way to give peace to his restless soul. For true victory, as he now understood, lay not in overpowering an opponent, but in healing the wounds that battle had left behind. The portkey activated at 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Flitwick felt the familiar tug behind his navel. The world blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors, and the next moment he stood on a narrow street in the center of magical Prague, holding an old watch in his hand, their means of transportation. Beside him materialized Professor Thane, barely maintaining her balance after the journey. She was dressed in a dark traveling cloak and carried a valise with an extension charm, typical luggage of an experienced traveler. "Well then," she said, looking around, "Prague is as beautiful as I remember." Flitwick nodded, but his gaze was focused on the observatory tower that rose above the city's rooftops. Even in daylight, it had a mysterious appearance, an ancient stone structure wrapped in legends and magic. It was there, on its highest roof, that he was destined to meet the Echo in 3 days. "First we need to find a hotel," he said. "Then I should like to visit the observatory archives. Perhaps records of that duel from 30 years ago have been preserved there." They set off along the narrow cobblestones of the magical quarter. Prague had always possessed a special atmosphere. Here antiquity mingled with modernity, and every building hid its secrets. Shops selling alchemical ingredients stood beside cafes where wizards read morning newspapers, and over it all hung the aura of ancient magic. The Golden Star Hotel was situated in the very heart of the magical quarter. It was an old building with half-timbered walls and windows of colored glass that shimmered with all the shades of the rainbow. The proprietor was a portly wizard named Václav Sarek, who warmly greeted the guests from England. "Ah, Professor Flitwick," he exclaimed in Czech-accented English. "I remember you from the old days. You were a true star of our tournaments." "Thank you for the warm welcome, Mr. Sarek," Flitwick replied politely. "We need 2 rooms, if possible." Of course. For such an esteemed guest, anything at all." Sarek waved his wand, and 2 keys flew into the visitor's hands. "Have you come to participate in tournaments again? Though I heard you became a professor." "No, this time it's a personal matter," Flitwick said evasively. "Tell me, are the observatory archives open to visitors?" Sarek's face became more serious. "The archives, yes, they are open, but there's a new archivist working there. Old Vlastimil died 2 years ago, God rest his soul. The new one is a young fellow named Tomas Novak. Very thorough, but sometimes overly formal." "I see. And Professor Novotny? Is he still in charge of the observatory?" "Unfortunately, no. Zlatomir retired 5 years ago. The director now is Professor Anna Hlavakova, a very competent woman, but," he lowered his voice, "they say she has a difficult character." Flitwick thanked him for the information, and they went up to their rooms. The professor's chamber was cozy, with a view of the square, old furniture, and a fireplace in which flames crackled merrily. He unpacked his belongings and sat by the window, watching the street life below. An hour later they met in the hotel restaurant. Thane looked fresh and ready for action, though concern was evident in her eyes. "I've been in touch with my contacts at the ministry," she said quietly, leaning across the table. "There's interesting information about Darkling." "What exactly?" "It turns out he wasn't simply practicing dark magic after that defeat. He was trying to find a way to, how shall I put it, transfer someone else's magical power to himself." Flitwick raised his eyebrows. "That's impossible. Magic is an inseparable part of one's personality." "So it was believed. But Darkling was convinced he had found a way." He studied ancient rituals, experimented with forbidden artifacts. Thane produced a bundle of papers from her pocket. Here are copies of ministry reports about his activities in his final years. Flitwick examined the documents. Darkling had indeed been obsessed with the idea of transferring magical abilities. He had traveled throughout Europe, seeking ancient manuscripts, communicating with dark wizards, even attempting to contact malevolent spirits. It says here that he died during an attempt to perform the ritual of eternal revenge, Flitwick said, reading the final report. What is that? Our experts were never able to fully determine. But judging from the fragments that remained after the explosion in his laboratory, he was trying to create a magical entity that could preserve his personality after death and give him a second chance to defeat you. A cold wave ran down Flitwick's spine. So that echo. Exactly. It seems the ritual worked partially. Darkling died, but his obsession with revenge created this entity. Thane leaned closer. And the worst part is that according to the ritual's description, the echo becomes stronger with each encounter with its target. So I'm playing into its hands by coming here. Possibly. But we also have an advantage. We know what we're dealing with. After lunch, they set out for the magical observatory. The building rose above the city on a low hill, its stone walls covered with ivy, and its towers reaching toward the sky like the fingers of a giant. At the entrance, they were met by a young woman in severe black robes. Professor Flitwick? She asked in English with a strong Czech accent. I am Professor Anna Hlavakova, director of the observatory. I was informed of your visit. Pleased to meet you, Flitwick replied, shaking her hand. This is Professor Cassandra Thane from Hogwarts. Hlavakova was a woman of about 50, with gray hair gathered in a severe bun and penetrating blue eyes. She led them through the observatory corridors, where the walls were hung with portraits of famous astronomers and wizards of the past. You're interested in archival records about tournaments, she said, leading them up spiral staircases. May I ask for what purpose? A personal matter, Flitwick replied cautiously. Connected to a duel from 30 years ago. Hlavakova's eyes flashed with interest, but she did not press. They reached large oak doors with a sign reading archives. Tomas, the director called. You have visitors. From behind one of the shelves emerged a young man of about 30, with curly dark hair and spectacles. He wore traditional archivist robes of gray-green. Tomas Novak, archivist, he introduced himself, nodding somewhat shyly. How may I help you? We're interested in records of the duel between Phileas Flitwick and Severus Darkling, which took place in the summer of 1993, Thane said. Novak thought, then nodded. Yes, I remember those records. One of the most famous duels in the observatory's history. One moment. He approached an enormous catalog that occupied an entire wall and began sorting through cards. After a few minutes, he retrieved a thick volume in leather binding. Here, Chronicles of Duels, Volume 47, Year 1993. He opened the book to the required page. Duel number 156. Phileas Flitwick versus Severus Darkling. July 15th, full moon, observatory roof. Flitwick approached the book. On the page was a detailed description of the duel, diagrams of spells used, even magical photographs of the match. In one of them he saw his younger self, golden sword in hand, and opposite, Darkling with a face twisted by anger. There are additional materials here, Novak said, retrieving a separate folder. Interviews with participants, arbiters' reports, medical certificates. Medical certificates? Thane inquired with interest. Yes, every tournament participant underwent medical examination before and after the duel. The archivist found the required page. Here's the report on Mr. Darkling. Thane read the document carefully, her face growing increasingly troubled. What is it? Flitwick asked. It says here that after the duel, Darkling showed anomalous magical fluctuations in his oral field and signs of mental instability. She looked at Flitwick. It seems the defeat had a more serious effect on him than it appeared. And here's something interesting, Novak said, turning pages. A week after the duel, Mr. Darkling returned to the observatory. On his own. Why? Flitwick asked. According to his words, he wanted to study the place of his defeat. Professor Novotny allowed him to spend a night on the observatory roof. But something strange happened. The archivist found another page with a security guard's report. The guard saw Darkling performing some sort of ritual at the site of the duel. He said strange light appeared over the roof, and the air became thick like syrup. In the morning they found Darkling unconscious, and strange symbols remained on the stone. What symbols? Thane asked tensely. Novak turned the page, and they saw a sketch. On the stone was carved a complex pattern, a circle with runes around the perimeter, inside which mysterious symbols intertwined. Oh, Merlin, Thane whispered. Those are genuine soul-binding runes. What? Flitwick didn't understand. Ancient dark magic. It allows one to bind part of a soul to a specific place. Thane's face paled. Phileas, Darkling didn't simply create an echo during his last ritual. He prepared the ground for it 30 years ago, right after your duel. Novak watched them with growing anxiety. Excuse me, but what's happening? Why are you so disturbed by these old records? Flitwick exchanged a glance with Thane. The young archivist seemed trustworthy, and his help might be needed. Tomas, the professor said seriously, what I'm about to tell you must remain between us. Severus Darkling has returned. How has he returned? He died, as a magical echo, and in 2 days, during the full moon, I must fight him again. On that same roof. Novak removed his spectacles and began cleaning them, a habit that betrayed his agitation. But that's impossible. I'm afraid it's quite possible, Thane interjected. And we need your help. Those runes on the roof, are they still there? I don't know, the archivist admitted. The roof is usually closed to visitors. But I have access. Excellent. Can you take us there now? Novak nodded, still stunned by the news. Of course. But first I need to get permission from Professor Hlavikova. The director proved more understanding than expected. After hearing the explanation, a somewhat abbreviated version of the truth, she gave permission to visit the roof. Just be careful, she warned. And if something truly supernatural happens, inform me immediately. The observatory roof was just as it had been 30 years ago, a wide stone platform surrounded by low balustrades. From all sides opened a wonderful view of Prague spread below. But Flitwick looked not at the city landscape. His attention was drawn to dark stains on the stone in the center of the platform. There they are, Novak said, approaching the strange marks. The runes were almost worn away by time, but still visible. The complex pattern stretched across the entire central part of the roof, creating an enormous circle about 10 meters in diameter. Thane knelt and carefully examined the symbols. This is more complex than I thought, she said. These aren't just binding runes. This is an entire ritual complex. What does it do? Flitwick asked. If I understand these symbols correctly. She traced one of the patterns with her finger. This spell creates a magical imprint of any powerful magical event that occurs within this circle, like a magical recording. And what can be done with this recording? Under normal circumstances, nothing. But if the person connected to that event dies with a strong emotional charge. Thane stood, her face grim. Then the imprint can come alive and use the energy of a living person for incarnation. Flitwick heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw a figure climbing the stairs to the roof. His heart froze. It was Darkling, but not in the form of a semi-transparent echo, but almost completely material. Greetings, old friend, Darkling said, his voice lively and malicious. I didn't expect to meet you here so soon. Novak cried out and hid behind the small telescope building. Thane drew her wand, but Darkling only laughed. Don't trouble yourself, or... Today I'm interested only in him. He nodded toward Flitwick. Though your presence here somewhat accelerates the process. Process? Flitwick asked, drawing his wand. Rebirth. The closer to the place of my first defeat, the stronger I become. And when the full moon reaches its zenith and illuminates this roof, Darkling spread his arms. I shall become powerful enough not merely to defeat you, but to replace you. Replace me? Take your life, your personality, your place in the world. Darkling's eyes burned with fanatic fire. Become who you are, but a better version. A version that never loses. Flitwick felt horror. This was far worse than he had thought. Darkling didn't simply want revenge. He was planning to literally steal his life. But until that moment, Darkling continued, I need to feed a little. He raised his hand, and from it burst a stream of dark energy. Not a spell, something far more primitive and terrible. Protego Maxima. Flitwick created a powerful shield, but the dark energy seeped through it like smoke through a sieve. The professor felt his strength leaving him. Memories of dueling victories became dimmer, and the sense of magical power gradually faded. Expelliarmus. Thane tried to disarm Darkling, but her spell passed through him without effect. I told you, today I'm interested only in him, Darkling said, not stopping the magical drain. Flitwick was falling to his knees. His breathing became heavy, and his hands trembled. A little more, and he would lose the ability to use magic entirely. Suddenly Novak jumped out from behind cover. Finite tot alum maxima. He directed his wand at the runes beneath their feet. The archivist was clearly not a strong duelist, but he knew his business. The powerful dispelling charm struck the ancient runes, and they blazed with bright light. Darkling screamed and jumped back. The dark energy that had been draining Flitwick's strength abruptly ceased. "What have you done, boy?" Darkling roared, his figure becoming semi-transparent again. "Temporarily deactivated the amplification runes," Novak replied, trembling but standing firm. "Without them you cannot fully feed on another's energy." Darkling looked at the archivist with fierce hatred. "Clever boy, but this is only a delay." He turned to Flitwick, who was slowly getting to his feet. "Tomorrow night, under the full moon, the runes will restore their power, and I will restore my might. Why can't you simply leave?" Flitwick asked, leaning on Thane. "You've been dead for 30 years. Why not find peace?" A shadow of pain flickered across Darkling's face. "Peace? Do you know what my life was like after that defeat?" His voice trembled with anger and suffering. "I lost everything. Reputation, respect, future. Everyone looked at me as a failure who had disgraced himself before the great champion. But you were talented. Talent without victories is nothing." Darkling interrupted. "You took from me the only thing I had, the hope of becoming someone significant. And for that you will pay." With these words he began to dissolve into the air, but before disappearing he added, "Tomorrow, Phileas. Tomorrow it all ends. Come alone, without your helpers. Otherwise I'll find you at Hogwarts and take not only your life, but the lives of all you love." When Darkling had completely vanished, silence reigned on the roof. Flitwick breathed heavily, still feeling the effects of the magical drain. Thane held his hand, and Novak stared at the spot where the echo had just stood. "Professor," the archivist said quietly, "what are we going to do?" Flitwick straightened, his gaze becoming resolute. "We're going to prepare." He looked at the destroyed runes. "Tomas, can you completely destroy these runes?" "I'm afraid not. They're too deeply rooted in the stone. I can only temporarily deactivate them. And if we found a way to change their purpose?" Thane asked. "Instead of strengthening Darkling, make them weaken him?" Novak pondered. "Theoretically possible. But for that we'd need someone who understands ancient runes and ritual magic well." "I know whom to invite," Flitwick said. "I have an old friend who lives here in Prague, a master of runic magic." They descended from the roof in complete thoughtfulness. Ahead lay a long night of preparation, and tomorrow, the most important duel of Flitwick's life. A duel that would decide not only his fate, but determine whether the restless soul of Severus Darkling could finally find peace. As they left the observatory, Flitwick turned and looked at the tower one last time. Tomorrow night he would return here, perhaps for the last time in his life. But he was determined to fight to the end, not only for his own life, but for the memory of that talented young wizard Severus Darkling had once been, before ambition and pride had destroyed his soul. The last day before the duel passed in frantic haste. Flitwick had not slept all night, working with an old friend, Professor Yaroslav Horza, a master of runic magic who had lived in Prague for more than 50 years. Horza was an elderly wizard with a long silver beard and eyes the color of old gold, which preserved the wisdom of centuries. They sat in his cozy workshop, cluttered with ancient manuscripts and magical artifacts. On the table lay diagrams of the runes from the observatory roof, and around them piles of books on runic magic. "This is indeed a complex case, Phileas," Horza said, adjusting his spectacles and studying the drawings. "Soul-binding runes, enhanced by a rebirth ritual. Someone knew ancient magic very well indeed. Can we alter them?" Flitwick asked, drinking his 5th cup of coffee that night. "Theoretically, yes, but it will be extraordinarily dangerous." The professor pointed to one of the runes. "Look, this rune corresponds to absorption of the defeated's energy. If we can reverse its meaning, then instead of absorption it will give." "Precisely. But the problem is that the change must occur at the moment of the rune's maximum activity. That is, during the duel, when they will be most dangerous." Flitwick nodded grimly. He understood the risk, but there was no other way out. "And how long will the alteration process take?" 3 to 4 minutes. But you'll have to hold Darkling all that time, not allowing him to interrupt the ritual." "I understand." Professor Thane entered the workshop, carrying a plate of sandwiches and another teapot of coffee. "How are things?" she asked. "We've found a way," Flitwick replied. "Dangerous, but possible." Thane set the food on the table and examined the diagrams. I understand the plan with the runes, but I have another thought, she said carefully. What if the problem isn't only magical? What do you mean? Darkling isn't simply a magical entity. He's the echo of a person who suffered. Perhaps what he needs isn't victory, but understanding. Horza looked at her with interest. An intriguing thought. Some ancient texts mention that the most powerful spell against vengeful spirits is forgiveness. But how does one forgive someone who wants to steal your life? Flitwick asked. Perhaps first one must understand his pain, Thane replied gently. In the morning they returned to the hotel. Flitwick slept for several hours, trying to restore his strength before the most important duel of his life. When he awoke, the sun was already setting, painting Prague's sky in golden-purple hues. Tomas Novak waited for them in the hotel lobby. The young archivist looked anxious but resolute. I've prepared everything, he said. Professor Hlavikova has given permission for access to the roof tonight. Officially, for astronomical observations. Thank you, Flitwick replied. But you and Professor Thane must remain below. The duel must be one-on-one. Phileas, Thane began. No, the professor interrupted firmly. This is my battle. My past mistakes. I must correct them myself. When the moon rose over Prague, they set out for the observatory. Silver light flooded the ancient streets, creating an atmosphere of magical mystery. Flitwick walked ahead, carrying in his hand a small bag with runic stones that Horza had given him. The observatory roof was bathed in moonlight. The runes on the stone glowed with a dim silver radiance, creating a complex pattern across the entire central part of the platform. The air here was thick, saturated with ancient magic. Flitwick walked to the center of the circle and stopped, waiting. The clock on the tower struck midnight. And then he appeared. Darkling materialized from the moonlight, as if sculpted from silver rays and shadows. But this time he looked completely human, young, handsome, powerful. His dark blue robes billowed in the night wind, and in his hand gleamed a wand of dark wood. At last, he said in a voice full of satisfaction, the time for revenge has come. Flitwick drew his wand and bowed, the ancient tradition of duelists. Severus, he said calmly, before we begin, I want to say something. Darkling raised an eyebrow, but did not attack. I remember that night 30 years ago. I remember your mastery, your passion for magic. You were one of the most talented duelists I had ever encountered. Flattery will not save you, Darkling replied coldly. This isn't flattery. It's the truth. Flitwick took a step forward, and I also remember the pain in your eyes after the defeat. I was so focused on my own victory that I didn't think about what the loss meant to you. Something flickered in Darkling's eyes. Surprise? Uncertainty? You actually think about that? I've thought about it for 30 years. About all my opponents, about how my glory was built on their defeats. Flitwick lowered his wand. I regret it, Severus. I regret that I couldn't then extend a helping hand instead of simply walking away in triumph. The runes beneath their feet blazed with brighter light. Darkling felt this and smiled cruelly. Beautiful words. But too late. He raised his wand. Now I shall take everything you have. The duel began. Darkling attacked with furious force. Beams of dark red light flew from his wand, leaving traces in the air that smoldered like wounds. Flitwick deflected the attacks, retreating around the circle, trying not to step on the runes. Protego horribilis. He created a powerful shield, but Darkling's magic seeped through it, draining his strength. Do you feel it? Darkling laughed, advancing. Do you feel how your glory flows to me? Flitwick indeed felt it. Memories of his victories were dimming, his dueling skills were leaving him. But he continued to fight, gradually circling around and approaching the place where he had hidden Horza's runic stones. Expecto Patronum. From his wand burst a silver stag, but Darkling laughed and dispersed it with a dark spell. A Patronus? Against me? I'm not a Dementor, old man. I am living hatred. The next attack threw Flitwick to the edge of the roof. He barely stayed on his feet, feeling blood trickle from a scratch on his cheek. Stupefy. A red beam flew at Darkling, but he easily deflected it. Your magic weakens with each minute, he said with sadistic pleasure. A little more, and you'll be defenseless. And then what? Flitwick asked, secretly groping for Horza's stones with his hand. Then I'll enter your body, take your name, your place, your life. I'll become Professor Phileas Flitwick, but better, more powerful, one who will never know defeat. And what will you do with my students? Darkling stopped, this incongruous thought suddenly striking him. Students. Yes, my pupils at Hogwarts. Hundreds of young wizards who trust me, who learn from me. What will happen to them when you take my place? The first crack appeared in Darkling's resolve. I will teach them to be stronger. As you became stronger, through hatred and revenge. Flitwick rose, taking out the runic stones. Severus, look at yourself. Look at what you've become. Is this what you wanted 30 years ago? Be silent. Darkling struck with a bolt of dark magic, but Flitwick was ready. Proteum sacrificium. He threw the first runic stone to the center of the circle. The stone shattered with a bright flash, and one of the binding runes began to change its form. Darkling felt it instantly. What are you doing? What must be done? Flitwick replied, throwing the second stone. Darkling rushed toward him, but the runes beneath their feet began to glow with unstable light. The magical energy flowing from Flitwick suddenly stopped. No! Darkling screamed. You cannot stop this. I have the right to revenge. You had the right to a better life, Flitwick replied, throwing the third stone. You had the right to a second chance, to understanding, to support, but not to this. The fourth stone. The runes began to glow with golden light instead of silver. Energy, instead of flowing to Darkling, began returning to Flitwick. No! The despair in Darkling's voice was genuine, deep. You don't understand. I have nothing. Even death brought me no peace. The fifth stone. The last one. The circle exploded with golden light. Darkling screamed, but this was not a cry of anger. It was a cry of pain accumulated over years of loneliness and despair. Flitwick felt his strength, memories, mastery returning. But he took no joy in this. Instead, he looked at Darkling, who was slowly becoming more transparent. Severus, he said gently, I cannot give you back the life you lost, but I can give you what you always needed. What? Darkling whispered, his figure flickering like a candle in the wind. Recognition. Memory. Flitwick raised his wand, but not to attack. You were an outstanding duelist. Your shadow dance technique was beautiful. Your passion for magic was genuine. Darkling looked at him with disbelief. But I lost. Lost doesn't make you lesser, Flitwick said. It makes you human. Perfect duelists don't exist. There are only those who continue trying to become better. Tears glistened in Darkling's eyes. I hated you for so long, dreamed of this moment for so long. And now. Darkling looked at his hands, which were becoming increasingly transparent. Now I'm simply tired, so deadly tired of hatred. Flitwick approached him. Then let it go. Release the anger, revenge, pain. Find peace, Severus. But how? Darkling whispered. I don't know how to do that. Begin with forgiveness. Forgive yourself for not being able to become who you wanted. Forgive me for not understanding your pain then. And forgive the world for not being what you imagined it to be. Darkling closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was no hatred in them, only weariness and release. Can you forgive me for what I wanted to do to you? I already have, Flitwick replied sincerely. You acted from pain, not from evil. Darkling smiled. For the first time in 30 years his smile was genuine. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for reminding me who I was before hatred consumed my soul. His figure began to dissipate, but now it resembled not destruction but liberation, as if a heavy burden was finally lifting from his soul. Farewell, Filius, he said, his voice becoming distant and peaceful. Be a better teacher than I was a student. Farewell, Severus. May you find the peace you sought for so long. With these last words, Darkling vanished. He did not dissolve in anger or despair. He simply peacefully departed, as if falling asleep after a long and wearisome journey. The runes on the roof went dark. The moon still shone over Prague, but the atmosphere had changed. Gone was that heavy, oppressive energy that had accumulated in this place for years. Flitwick sat on the stone floor, feeling enormous fatigue. Not physical, emotional. For 30 years he had unconsciously carried within him a sense of guilt for what had happened to that talented young duelist. Now this burden was finally lifted. Footsteps on the stairs announced the approach of Thane and Novak. They carefully climbed to the roof, fearing what they might see. Professor? Thane called. All is well, Flitwick replied, rising. It's finished. And Darkling? He found peace. Novak looked at the extinguished runes with the curiosity of a researcher. They're completely destroyed, he said with amazement, as if they were never here at all. Perhaps that's how it should be, Flitwick replied. Some things from the past shouldn't be preserved forever. They descended from the roof in silence. Prague slept around them, peaceful and beautiful under the moonlight. But for Flitwick, this was not simply the end of an adventure. It was the end of a long internal struggle with his own past. In the morning they packed at the hotel. The portkey to Hogwarts was scheduled for 10 in the morning. "You know," Thane said, folding her robes, "I learned a great deal these past few days. Such as that the most powerful magic isn't the spells we learn from books. It's understanding, compassion, the ability to see the person behind their actions." Flitwick nodded. Severus wasn't evil. He was broken, and perhaps if 30 years ago someone had extended him a helping hand. "Don't blame yourself," Thane said gently. "You were young, focused on your own career. That's normal, perhaps. But now I know better." Flitwick looked out the window at awakening Prague. "Now I understand why I left the dueling arena for teaching. Victories over people are temporary satisfaction. But helping someone become better, that's forever." Tomas Novak came to see them off to the departure point. The young archivist looked changed, more confident, more mature. "Thank you," he said, "for allowing me to be part of this story." "We should thank you," Flitwick replied. "Without your help, everything could have ended quite differently. If you ever decide to change careers," Thane added with a smile, "Hogwarts always needs good defense against the dark arts teachers." Novak laughed. "Perhaps someday. But for now I have work here, preserving history, so that future generations can learn from the mistakes of the past." The portkey activated precisely at 10. The last thing Flitwick saw, transporting back to Scotland, was the towers of the magical observatory rising above Prague in the morning sun. But now they didn't seem threatening or full of painful memories. They were simply beautiful old buildings, part of the great and wondrous magical world. A week after returning to Hogwarts, Flitwick stood before a class of 7th years who were submitting essays on the Fidelius charm. Among the students was Miss Waverley from Ravenclaw, whose work now included deep reflections on the ethical responsibility of those who keep secrets. "Professor," one of the Hufflepuff students asked, "could you tell us about your dueling career? We heard you were a champion." Flitwick pondered. Previously he had avoided such conversations, believing his past as a duelist had no bearing on teaching charms. But now he understood that every experience, even painful, could become a lesson. "You know what?" he said, sitting on the edge of the desk. "I'll tell you a story about a talented young duelist named Severus Darkling, and about how important it is to remember that behind every defeat stands a living person with their own dreams and hopes." The students listened, entranced, and Flitwick told them about glory and downfall, about mistakes and forgiveness, about how true strength lies not in the ability to defeat others, but in the ability to understand them and help them become better. Outside the window, autumn sun gilded the walls of Hogwarts, and in the charms classroom occurred what the school existed for: the transmission not only of knowledge but of wisdom from one generation to the next. Somewhere in the peaceful depths of the afterworld, the soul of a young duelist named Severus Darkling finally slept a peaceful sleep, freed from the burden of hatred and revenge. And his story lived on, not as a warning about the danger of ambition, but as a lesson about the power of understanding and the importance of compassion. The end.